So, I'm Brad Shively. I work at Uber Advanced Technologies Group, which is the self-driving car group at Uber. So, I work on developer productivity. No pressure there. Just make sure 100% of developers are productive 100% of the time. So we work on tools and workflows, which means trying to make the build not suck. And we work on testing and CI pipelines, which means try to make the tests not suck. And a lot of what my team does is run distributed build infrastructure, including kind of compilation farms, linking farms, caching layers. We use Bazel, so if you know about Bazel or you know about software build systems, I would love to talk to you after this. If you don't blank, then blank. A lot of emails start this way, and this is basically a simple filter. If you don't use this service, then you won't care about this email. And I want to make sure I don't waste your time, so if you don't communicate with other humans, then this talk isn't for you. So hopefully you agree that means this talk is largely for everyone. I don't see anyone running out of the room yet, despite my slide snafu. So great, we're all in agreement that this talk is for everyone. I've got some bad news though. This talk is about email. I'm sure you're all really excited to think about your inboxes right now. So does anyone feel like they don't get enough email? Cool, I saw at least one hand, so send me your email address and you can handle all of mine. And another thing I'm interested in is, how happy are you with your email right now? Would you say that like 100% of your email is good email? What about like 50%? All right, I see one or two hands. Maybe like 10%? That's kind of where I would expect a lot of people to fall in. Like 1 in 10 emails is useful or actionable or has a clear purpose, and then the other 9 are garbage. So we should probably ask what even is a good email. And I'll start with my one simple email rule, which is don't make me WTF. So you probably react this way to email pretty often. Maybe you're thinking about the last time, maybe it was this month, maybe it was this week or today. Maybe it's happening right now because I said this is to talk about email and you immediately dove into your smartphone and started ignoring me. And there are a lot of reasons this can happen. Maybe the email is long and you're just like, I'm not gonna read all this. Maybe it's confusing. Maybe it's unclear if someone is just telling you something, like an FYI, or if they're asking you to take some action. A lot of times something is like a to-do in disguise. Like, hey, here's just an announcement, but actually it means I have to go move all my services out of a data center or something like that. So, these are the kinds of, the gamut of emails we deal with is everything from they're shutting down the data center all your services live in to there are cupcakes in the East Cafe and they're not the shitty Costco ones, they're from the cool bakery down the street, so it's worth the trek to get them. So, communication is an essential engineering skill. And we need to change the way we think about emails, presentations, meetings. I would say even the way we explain things in conversation. And the reason is we're all experts in something, and we're always communicating with non-experts. So this makes perfect sense. Say there are 10 software teams at your organization. So you run some platform. The other 9 teams are depending on that platform. They're not the experts that you are as the team that builds and runs that platform. So we have to kind of meet those teams where they are and use language they understand, give them the appropriate context so they can make good decisions. So it turns out we do okay talking about software and systems when we're talking to a mirror of ourselves. Like within our teams, it's never a problem because we have a bunch of shared context. It's when we go outside of those boundaries, we talk to outsiders, we talk to customers, that's where we really hit snags. And we all need to get better at honing our message for our audience. That's the key point here. So I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Engineering communication is broken. We're all being bombarded with emails. We generate a ton of data, but none of it's very useful. It's not clear when action's required or when it's not. And we make a lot of bad assumptions in the communications we send that people understand what we're talking about when they obviously don't. And I'm here to convince you that storytelling is the solution to this problem. So the thing is, everything's a story and everyone's a storyteller. We're all telling stories all the time because we communicate all the time. So there are some practical exceptions here. You don't need to tell a story when the building's on fire. You probably don't need to tell a story about the origin of the cupcakes when they're in the East Cafe. Just tell people that they're there. But when your service changes, you tell a story. When a reorg happens, you tell a story. And we have this responsibility to our audience to help them understand the narrative that we are trying to get across to them. Most of us are just pretty bad at storytelling because we don't realize we're doing it. Communicating concisely is actually a lot harder than writing pages and pages or just dumping a bunch of data into an email. So there's this often misattributed quote, I would have written a shorter letter if I had more time. So we just kind of say facts and data. We dump a bunch of things into an email. We don't do the hard work of cutting out what we can and making our communication short and focused. So can't decide what's important? Just dump a bunch of garbage, send a 5,000 word email, good to go. So why? Why should you bother telling stories? You know, you're all engineers, system administrators. I can just be able to tell people facts, give them the data, they'll figure it out, they're all smart. The thing is they won't, and not because they're not smart, just because, again, they don't have the context you have, but even if they would figure out what you wanted them to, there are still good reasons to tell a story. So storytelling causes changes in your brain. It causes the release of neurochemicals, dopamine and oxytocin that activate the reward center of your brain, that create empathy, that kind of cause these pro-social good behaviors. So it's not just about warm and fuzzy, it's about working together more efficiently. And the big thing is stories result in better understanding, they result in more voluntary compliance, and they improve memory. And those are like all the things I want when I send an email to my software org. I want people to understand what I say. If I'm asking them to do something, I want them to go and do it, and I want them to remember the things I say long term. So there are tons of incentives to tell stories. In short, if you want them to listen, understand, and remember, tell a story. So this is probably a good time to point out that this is not a TED Talk. I'm not going to tell you about my childhood. I'm not going to tell you about how I learned to ride a bike or how building systems is just like baking cookies with my gram. I'm not going to tell you to open up and be vulnerable or how to find your voice. Like those are important, but they're different than what I'm talking about. And there are lots of great TED Talks on storytelling. You should go watch them. This is not that. I'm here to tell you that there's a form of storytelling that is super useful to us as engineers, and we should work on that. So how do we do it? The most important thing is identifying your audience and understanding who you're actually talking to. Everything else is built on this. If you don't do it, you'll fail. A great example is think about how you would update your CEO on a project versus how you would talk to the tech lead on the team about the same project. So if you talk to your CEO, you're probably talking about the strategic benefits to the business, the quarter level plan. We're going to launch this. This is the part of the business that enables. Here's like the customer problem that will solve. If you're talking to the tech lead, you're probably talking day-to-day level granularity in the weeds on specific tasks. Here's why that's blocked. Here's what we're going to do to fix it, et cetera. And the reason is those two people speak like entirely different languages. Their frame of reference could not be further apart. And so we need to have this mindset when we communicate with our engineering organizations. So we all kind of have this thing we imagine, which is there's all this information that everyone knows in the org. Like we all just agree implicitly on what that service is for, what that process looks like. And then here's like what my audience knows or my customer. Like they know like a little sliver of stuff that not everyone knows. But then like, here's what I know because I'm a genius. Like I've got the big brain strats. I know everything my customer knows. I know everything the owner knows, but I know like so much more too. But that's not really how reality looks. Reality looks like this. There's this tiny little nugget that we all know because mostly we like secretly disagree about everything and we don't know that. So, you know, we use terminology differently. We have overloaded acronyms. There's all these aspects of working in an engineering organization that just cause us to sort of silently disagree about things. So then my customer knows a lot of things. And painful as it is to admit, they probably know a lot more than I do. And this is just for like the platform problem I was describing earlier. If there's 10 teams, I'm on one of them, 90% of the org is gonna implicitly know more than 10% of the org. That's just the way that works. So there is some overlap between you and your audience. but you need to work to bridge this gap over time, and you especially need to work to not assume that this yellow section is gigantic. Most people in the org do not know the things you know, but you also do not know the things most people in the org know. So again, your job as a storyteller is to map your brain onto the audience's brain. And this might seem like a weird analogy, but I think of this the way I think of global and local variables. So again, there are not a ton of globals. That set is very small. You should not make assumptions that everyone agrees that CI stands for continuous integration, or it refers to a specific system or something like that. And then there are a lot of sort of local sets, local state. Your team has its internal state. Another team has a separate internal state. And a lot of what you're doing as a communicator is trying to map your world onto their world so you can use language they're familiar with, tell a story that makes sense to them. So you need to understand how they think, and then you need to learn to speak in those terms. So once you know who your audience is, you have to figure out what story you're actually telling. And to do this, we're going to kind of look at very basic, literally like elementary school elements of storytelling. So the first is, who's your character? So you're probably like, all right, this talk's bullshit. I'm going to go get some more coffee. What is this guy talking about characters? Well, in our case, a character can be a system. It can be a piece of software or a release. It's just what is changing in this communication. It's pretty uncommon to send an email that says like, hey everyone, everything's still the same as it was yesterday. Thanks for reading my email. Like, presumably if you're communicating, it's because you're communicating some change. So again, it could also be a person or a team, like say in a reorg, or if your scope is changing. Character could be a person or a team. And then what is the character arc? And this is kind of hearkening back to, again, middle school English class. What is the change and how does it affect your audience? So I usually use something like X has changed in way Y due to Z. So this system is different now. Here's what the difference is, and here's the reason for that difference. And that's a pretty easy kind of line of thinking to follow. And I think a mistake we make a lot is just saying like, X is different now, with no explanation as to why. So the last thing we have to do is tell the story with context. And context is super important. The amount that's required, again, relates back to who your audience is and who you are. You're kind of trying to use context to bridge the gap between what you know and what they know. So let's apply literally none of what we just talked about and write an email. So our subject is remote testing. I've focused on testing just because this is what my team does, but all this stuff generalizes to really any sort of specialization that your team is responsible for. Remote test execution has been launched. Cool. So is this email good or bad? Does anyone think this is a great email? Okay. Does anyone think this is a terrible email? Okay. Good. I see some ambivalence, and that's what I want to see. It depends, and it depends on who is our audience. So audience is the key to whether communication is effective or not. I see some like self-high fives happening, which is awesome. So if my audience is the build team, it's my team, we have a lot of local context in common. We probably have similar ideas about things. Maybe this remote testing thing was like a 6-month project, and this is just the eagle has landed email. Like, hey, it's on now, we shipped it, awesome. In this case, it's a great communication. It's super concise, gets the point across. But let's assume this email is for the entire software org. So, pros, easy and fast to write. I'm so efficient, I should get a promotion. It took me 30 seconds to achieve complete alignment with the entire engineering organization in a 1-line email. Cons, literally everything else. So it's confusing, it's ineffective, it's gonna generate a ton of follow-up questions. It's only useful to people that are already in the know. I have this idea in my head, and hopefully some of you agree with it. I'm not just up here talking to myself. Bad emails are like bad software. A lot of times you write a bad email because it was faster to write it poorly than to write it correctly. But the thing is, when you write a bad email, you've just offloaded your thinking to 500 or 1,000 other people. So instead of you having to take the time once to figure out how to say what you're trying to say, you now are making 500 people trying to make sense of your nonsense. So it's the same as like when you write a bad unit test and it fails like 1 out of 50 times, but you can get it green long enough to pass CI. Well, now just the org pays that flaky test penalty over and over and over again as long as it exists. So there are really strong incentives to do things right in terms of communication the first time. Plus, like honestly, you can save yourself a lot of pain by avoiding a million follow-up emails, et cetera. So responses you might expect to this email are, so what? Or why are you telling me this? Or worst of all, silence. Silence is the sound of, I saw an email, I didn't know what it meant, and I certainly didn't care to figure it out, and I deleted it. So it's the same as if you never sent it. So am I announcing that tests are now better or worse? And more importantly, do I want recipients to take some action? This is like the key thing. If you expect people to do something, you need to be very explicit about this. So I say like, don't tiptoe up to the line of explanation, dive headfirst across it. Like you shouldn't say like X and Y, you should say X and Y, therefore Z. And that's what people tend to leave off is that, therefore, here is the conclusion I'm asserting. So let's talk about data. I'm sure this group loves data. Everyone here makes purely data-driven decisions, right? I'm sure at some point you've said, just show me the data. I can make a fact-based decision on my own. And I'm sure right now some of you are thinking, don't waste my time with storytelling. The thing is, just data often isn't really that useful. And there's also a lot of research that shows that pretty much when given raw data, you just use it to prop up the conclusions you've already reached. So let's take a look at our email again. Remote testing results. Oh, this will be much better. Look, now we're providing data. So remote testing has been enabled. Attached are results from several test runs. There you go. Let's call it a day. This is way better, right? Look at all that data. Data could also be a bunch of graphs without a clear conclusion, or a single number without a prior reference point, something like that. So again, responses. What delete? Just get out of here. It's our responsibility to tell the story clearly. So you make data useful with context, analysis, and insights. So I have a coworker who's like one of those Unix wizard guys, and I'm sure his setup looks like some of yours, where he's got 37 terminal windows and 3 builds running, and a container in one and a cloud instance in the other, and all this stuff. But sometimes he does this thing where he makes noises at me like someone at a bus stop who's trying to drag me into a conversation unwillingly, just like, can you believe this? And then it's like, eventually I'm being like pulled over to his desk, and he's just gesturing wildly at like one of the 37 terminals. And it's like, can you believe this? And it's like, yeah, it's totally outrageous. See you later. Cupcakes in the East Cafe. Gotta go. And the reason is like, I have no idea what he's talking about because I don't have the context for what he's showing me. And so with like some analysis and some crafting of a message, I would understand like, oh, the build just got 40% slower. Great. But without that, I'm sort of left clueless and unwillingly dragged into a conversation. So this has a bunch of names, sometimes called the wisdom hierarchy, or the knowledge hierarchy, or the data pyramid. But it basically shows the relationship that exists between data up to wisdom. And it turns out that when we apply effort, we can turn data into something more useful. So this is something we should really be doing for our audience, because it also turns out that when you apply effort, it becomes more valuable. So don't give me a text file full of test results, give me an explanation as to what changed and if we're seeing the result we expected. So formulaic emails are bad, but here's a formula for better than average engineering emails. So to start, TLDR, one-line summary of what we're seeing. If you blah, then blah. This is just a filter. It's honestly more of a courtesy than a necessity, but if people quickly realize that your emails will reliably self-select, they'll be more inclined to read them over time as you build a relationship with your organization. So System X is now better, different, worse, whatever, in aspect Y, due to change Z. Now, if we can provide a graph or a dashboard or something like that, that's great. And then for those very interested, see details below. So a key thing here is I think some people get this kind of bad taste in their mouth when I talk about storytelling because they think of it as spin. Like, I'm trying to give you my version of reality and get you to buy into it so you don't ask me tough questions. That's not the case at all. You shouldn't hide the details. You should be open, but be clear at the same time. You know, the key thing is giving people the amount of information that they need, and then if for the small percentage that are super interested in the details, make them available to them and let them, you know, kind of dig into that at their leisure. So let's rewrite our email. Remote CI testing is now faster. Already, this is like a huge improvement. Like, for some percentage of users, that's enough information. They could just archive this email without ever opening it. So TLDR, faster test results and queue submissions by hundreds of seconds. So a thing I want to call out here is I'm using a global in this statement. So you probably don't know what the queue is. It's our CI pipeline, but I know that everyone at my company that works on software knows what that is. So I'm free to say one little piece of jargon that I know is broadly available. Excuse me, but again, we should keep this to a minimum. I should not, you know, broadly assume that everyone in the organization has all these pieces of information that they may or may not. So if you don't work in this repo, this doesn't concern you. The key thing I would call out about this, you know, the suite now supports remote test execution. It's faster. No action is required by you to see these benefits. I think like this is a common thing that someone would leave out. They would say like, hey, we made this change, but you have to rebase to get the benefit of it. Or you have to switch over to some new cluster that you've never heard of, or something like that. So it's great to announce that something is available, but we should also include the steps to achieve the benefits. Excuse me. Again, referencing the PR. So if you want to know about the details of this change, here's the PR where you can find out all about it. And lastly, a nice graph. And again, a small point, but a lot of people would just include this graph. Like, hey, look, the graph went down. That's good, right? But there's a very clear inflection point on this graph. So it makes sense to label that inflection point. This is when the launch happened. I think a lot of people would leave that open to interpretation. Again, don't tiptoe up to the line of explanation. Dive headfirst across it. So a quick tactical recap. Understand who your audience is and what story you're telling. If you ignored everything else I said, please just remember this. Like, this is the most important bit. Think about who you're writing for. Context is ridiculously important, and it's incumbent on you to figure out how much to provide and where the conflicts are in your local variables versus your audience's local variables. And there are very few globals. So I would say this is the most common mistake people make, and it leads to tons and tons of painful follow-up emails. You just say something very casually off the cuff in an email, or you use some acronym, and then the flood starts. Just like the first comes in, and then the third, and then the 10th, and there's just people saying, like, I don't know what you're talking about. Does my team need to do something? What is this service? Do we rely on this? Turn data into wisdom. So do the heavy lifting, push your way up the pyramid, and you'll create a lot of value in the process. Ask. If you want me to do something, ask. Be direct and clear about the implications of your emails. You know, the worst case scenario is you send an email, it's something like, we're shutting down a data center. Okay. Do I need to move my services, or are you just gonna be super nice and move them for me? I mean, I'm gonna plead ignorance, and hopefully you're gonna migrate them for me. So, or I'll be that like last tenant out that, I waited until the last possible second because I didn't know for 2 quarters that I needed to move. Subtlety is not your friend in engineering communications. Tell. So be explicit, make your point. Don't gesture wildly at a huge data file or your screen full of terminals, assuming I'll figure out the implication. You need to tell me very explicitly what the story is here, what the conclusion that's being reached is. And as an absolute last resort, use the formula. So it's not perfect, but a brief summary, a clear filter, and a well-defined arc can go a long way to helping people understand engineering communications. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. So it's time for questions. If everyone has a question, just please step forward to the mic.
I wonder if you have advice on when you get an email that you don't think has sufficiently story told to you. What do you do?
That's a good question. So if you're me, you turn into the crazy person that writes this talk to give as an internal talk to sort of politely and lovingly scold your engineering organization. Some of the stuff I cut for the public consumption version of this talk would probably make your head spin, like this slide that has 9 million words on it that was used in a weekly update every week. I think that if you feel like this is something you care about or it's like worth investing in, the best thing to do is to sort of like kind of try to coach people, again, in that loving way, like, hey, I'm trying to make us all better. Because it definitely is sensitive, like sort of criticizing the way people express themselves. But I would say like responding back with like hey, I think like these key points maybe could be a little clearer. It might be worth a follow-up. And no one's perfect. I certainly have sent a few emails that generated some buzz and then had to quickly like, hey, I'm getting this question a lot already. Let me, be a little more concise or explicitly address a few points that came up that I wasn't aware of, something like that.
Thank you.
Great talk, thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question around real-time communication using apps like Slack and Teams. How does storytelling work in that mode of communication?
That's a great question. So it turns out that I'm actually a big fan of real-time communication because I think it solves for a slightly different problem, which is like, to give you an example, my team is based in Pittsburgh. We are all, like the entirety of folks that report to me or sort of within my purview are in Pittsburgh. And we have a few customers we work pretty closely with. And there's one in particular where we kind of kept having bad interactions with him and I couldn't figure out why. Like, he was rubbing me the wrong way. He was causing problems with my team. People were kind of complaining to me. But then I was like, wait a minute. Whenever I talk to this guy in person, he's super nice and agreeable. Maybe it's just like a side effect of the medium. So we sort of all just unified an agreement that we should just talk to this guy on Zoom or on the phone or in person as much as we could. And that smoothed out the relationship a lot. And so I think that it becomes less necessary as you're having like an interactive dialogue because you can smooth out those inconsistencies or misunderstandings. So basically your message doesn't have to be as sharply crafted in a real-time format. But I certainly think that like having a thesis and sort of having a narrative arc of explanation can help, regardless of the medium.
Thanks.
So how do you handle communications where you have maybe a different message or a different focus that you're trying to impart to the different subgroups of your audience simultaneously?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a few ways to handle that. One is factor out the commonalities and make that into one communication, and then maybe do like follow-ups individually. I think like at a certain point you may have to make some compromises. You know, you don't want to, it's like, obviously you don't want to send 100 different emails to 100 different people. So it's finding the right balance of, is this going to address a need or is it going to cause more confusion? Like if I make some blanket statements, am I going to find that like 3 out of 5 groups are super unhappy with my blanket statements? If that's the case, then you may just have to meet with them individually or address them individually. But usually I'd probably tackle something like that by saying, here are the highlights for everyone, and then maybe like, here's a doc for one team, here's a doc for another team that sort of digs into the details and why they differ for each group.
Any more questions? Okay.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks again, Brad.